Welcome to Jewish Cinémathèque, where we meet some of the important faces involved with films that tackle aspects of the Jewish experience. Today we have the opportunity to speak about a compelling, a moving film, One Life. It's about Briton Nicholas Winton, who took it upon himself to work toward the rescue of Jewish children trapped in Central Europe on the eve of World War II. In all, together with his committed group of associates, 669 children were rescued. Nicky Winton's story is a film not just about Winton, but about a group of individuals who risked their lives to save others at the most dangerous of times. It's a human story about how good can sometimes win over indifference, how courage, how action can bring hope and save lives. One Life stars Johnny Flynn as 28-year-old Nicholas Winton and Sir Anthony Hopkins as Winton 50 years later. The cast includes Lena Olin, Helena Bonham Carter, Jonathan Pryce, and Marte Keller.
30 seconds to on air!
Okay, and you are just here.
Good night. Sit farther back.
Now, an extraordinary story about a young man who many years ago visited Prague. What he found there were thousands of refugees at the mercy of Hitler's imminent invasion.
Do you ever think about the children and what happened to them?
I bet you got some stories.
That's really not about me.
We are working to evacuate these children by train to safety in Britain.
Why are you doing this, Mr. Winton?
Because I may be able to do something about it. I must.
Go now.
Nicky, you must know we cannot save them all. You have to forgive yourself that.
I started, so I have to finish it.
We cannot let these people down.
It is incredible what you achieved.
We're doing as much as we can.
You have a lot of faith in ordinary people.
Because I'm an ordinary person.
Save one life, save the world.
Forgive me, but how many children are we speaking about?
Can I ask, is there anyone in the audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton?
One Life is directed by James Hawes, who joins us today along with Nicholas Winton's son, Nick Winton, and one of the children who refer themselves as Nicky's children, who was saved, Eva Paddock. James, Nick, Eva, welcome to Cinémathèque.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start with you, James. How did this all begin? I know that Barbara, Nick's sister, had written the story about Nicholas Winton back in 2014, and
it was even before that. So the producers who, from the company Cecil Films, Emil Sherman and Ian Canning, had just made a film called The King's Speech. They were looking for their next project, and like many of us perhaps, had seen the clip on YouTube of the 1980s TV show that would become such a trigger for the story. And they got in touch with Nicky and talked to him about making the film. The process thereafter was quite a while, and until after Nicky had died, and Barbara, who was in many ways the keeper of the family story at that moment and writing the biography of Nicky, was in discussion with them and about producing a script and making a film.
So our audience doesn't necessarily know that TV series, That's Life, and I'm so always wary about talking about it because for me that was, not knowing about it, made the film that much more impactful.
Okay, and I spoiler alert here, so let's be very, very careful.
Let's not talk about it.
Maybe there's a way of just alluding to it without blowing the whole end of the film. The key thing is there's this extraordinary, powerful British television institution called That's Life. A third of the population watched it every week. It's a very strange show in that it's a strange blend, or was a strange blend of, frankly, almost light entertainment, almost musical comedy, and much harder hitting campaigning items. And they were part of bringing the story of Nicky Winton and the Prague Rescue to a broader public.
Great. Almost like This Is Your Life, the American version, but very different.
No, that's not the basis of the story. What happened on this episode was similar to that. But that bit we're keeping for the audience to go and discover in the cinemas.
Discover it after watching the film. So Nick, tell us about your dad. What kind of guy was he? I mean, he was a stockbroker. There were tensions between, the West, between Britain and between Nazi Germany, but, tell us about him.
I think much more interesting, Eric, is that he was brought up to be a banker originally by a father who was a banker, and he was sent to learn about banking in Germany in 1930, 31, 32. And for the historians among you, you'll recollect that was just after the crash of 29. It was when Germany was struggling to repay the reparations from the Treaty of Versailles, and they had a couple of options to pay a bill that was by many reckoned to be unpayable, which was to default or to print the money to pay for it. And that led to hyperinflation in Germany. What a fantastic time to learn about banking.
Oh boy.
You're a German, son of German Jewish parents, learning banking in Germany at exactly that moment, which was the crucible out of which came the Holocaust.
And at that moment in time, his name was not Nicholas Winton, it was Nicholas Wertheim.
That's right, yeah.
So he was known as a Jew, or at least a Jewish name.
Exactly, yes, although he was brought up and sent to a Christian school. But yes, absolutely right.
So years later, he's volunteered, he's been an ambulance driver, he's done all kinds of wonderful things to help out in the war effort, and he's about to take a skiing trip. What happened?
It's the other. Yes, this is just before the war. He was very interested in current affairs, in politics. He had friends in the British Labour Party. He recalls having dinner with Nye Bevan, one of our leading politicians of the day, just before he announced what would become the foundation of the Health Service, which is one of the British institutions, saying it's not perfect, but it's the best that I can get through at the moment. And he was, probably because of his German legacy, much more aware of what was going on in Germany than the British government in the lead up to the Second World War. So it was probably because of that when he went on his skiing trip to Prague and he saw
what was to be a
skiing. Thank you. Yeah, but he saw the refugees, and he had probably more awareness, more understanding of what was likely to happen than the British government, who thought that we wouldn't go to war with Germany.
So at this point in time, we're talking about 1938?
Yeah, January 39.
Okay, so already parts of Czechoslovakia have been taken over.
The Sudetenland.
That's the middle of January 39.
Yeah, right.
Actually, the Germans walked into Prague on March 15th, 1939.
That was...
Where were you, Eva, at that moment in time?
Being a 3.5-year-old, living in Prague. My family had moved from Prasich, where I was born, to Prague. My mother was a physician. My father was working as an editor of a paper.
Where you were born, was that part of what was then Czechoslovakia?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And we were living in Prague.
And, I mean, your parents, professionals, doing well?
Yes. So, to bring it into the Jewish context, we were a family of typical Central European upper middle class intellectuals, as I said, not practicing Jews, but that's who we were. My mother had been born in Russia. She was Russian, and her family was very observant. She wanted to go to medical school. There was a quota. She didn't get into medical school in Russia. She went to Czechoslovakia, learned Czech, and did her medical training at Charles University. And we lived in a small town in Prosek, and then they had moved to Prague. And all I know is that we were put on a train on July 29th, 30th, 1939, to go to England. Yes.
James, you had the challenge of having to recreate this. Children coming from all parts of Central Europe, gathering together. I don't know whether you were living in some refugee camp at that point?
No, I should, and I do try to clarify this because we were living in the center of Prague, in a very well hill community, and my mother, in a way that I do not know, heard about that there was this person taking names and children. So that part of the film is very accurate in my life experience. The queuing up with the photograph and giving Nicky the pictures. I was very fortunate. We were not in those camps. And of course there were kinder transports previously that had come from Germany, but there was nobody attending to children in the Czech Republic. And that was what Nicky found, and that was where he started his activity. Yes.
So James, is this just a story about Nicholas Winton, or is it more?
It's much, much bigger than that. I mean, there's one thing I want to say in response to what Eva's describing as well, from slightly outside your story and your experience, just to think about the foresight and the courage of those parents in that moment, to think they can see what's coming, or they can see a version of what might be coming, and they make this incredible, brave decision for the good of their children to give them up to strangers they're not even going to meet. I mean, that's enormous. Yeah, it's a much bigger story.
If they had more than one child, they were limited?
No.
They could.
No, it was about, and in fact, that's one of the things. It's almost charmingly disorganized with respect to your father, Nick. He saw something that needed doing, and he went about it in what was a fairly ad hoc way, because they were making it up as they went along, and there wasn't time to say, let's make a plan, and then 6 weeks later we'll come back and we'll execute that part of it. It wasn't like that. It was start now. And so they knew they had to gather names. They had to get lists. And as the film depicts, getting lists of people's names and addresses at that point was tough because people were hiding, and lists and names could end up in the wrong hands. So this huge part of it was about access to trust to the people that held those directions to the children that needed. And I think also something we tried to create in the film is this sense, as Eva talks about, of the mix of those refugees. These were people, not all Jewish, but who'd come from Germany, from Berlin, from Austria, from Vienna, from the Sudetenland, from other areas of Czechoslovakia, of all stations in life, of all levels of wealth, because they knew what was coming, because they'd had to run. And we went out of our way to try and reflect those different tribes, as we called them, those people from such different backgrounds who all had the same imperative, which was to try and seek safety for their family.
So you shot in Prague itself. It must have been very difficult shooting a 1938-39 era film in today's Prague.
Some of it is, obviously, because so much of it has changed. And we had very limited time and resources on what is a very ambitious piece. You need trains, you need children. Children can only work certain hours in any given day for very good reasons. What was astonishing was the reception we received in Prague from the authorities, from the government, and also from individuals, because they very much own the story of Nicholas Winton and the story of the Prague rescue. So when, as a film company, you turned up and said, we'd like to film on this difficult location, we were embraced. And we were there on the same platform of Wilson Station, the central Prague station, recreating what had happened for Eva and the 668 others 85 years previously.
I want to just step back for a moment, because you began your career studying law. And then you went on to largely do documentaries. both in the United States and in Britain. And so you come into this film, this is your first theatrical film. You've done television films as a documentarian. So you have this talent, I think, as a fact-based director. How was that? This was your first hurrah.
I hope it's a hurrah.
It is a hurrah.
Thank you. Yes, you're quite right. I owe my career to the BBC in its glory days. And by that I mean I grew up in news and current affairs and documentaries. And the rigour of a broadcasting institution like that is that they keep you sharp and true to the story, and they teach you how to find your facts and to focus them. We used to have a discipline that if you were pitching an idea, you had to write it in 50 words for what would be the listings billing for the TV schedules, and if you couldn't get it sharp in those 50 words and tell us the story you're going to make with them, we're not interested in you pitching the idea any further. That lives on. I find telling true stories compelling, even though it comes with a particular responsibility to the truth, to the facts, to the people whose story you're bringing alive. And it is tough, because you can't tell it dot and comma correctly. The moment I choose where to aim the camera, I've made a different choice. I don't know what Nick's father said at any given moment, so we have to be true to the essence of it. And then I have this fantastic team, from the writers through the costume and props people, who made those documents to within a millimetre of their historical accuracy.
So you tried really to be, I mean, that's hard in a theatrical film.
It is, but do you know, I think it's really important, and there may be some of the audience who say, well, I don't care about the detail, but you know, you may not think you do, but you do. Because what that gives an individual actor is a trust in the world that they're living in and inhabiting. They know how a prop works. They know that that document is true and that one is fake. And when they believe that, and the audience believes this world you've created, you will go with the story that much more emotionally. You'll trust it.
Nick, when you were watching this, watching your dad being portrayed by two wonderful actors, Johnny and Anthony, how did that resonate with you?
It was very difficult. I mean, the later version of my father by Anthony Hopkins was just extraordinary. He is so like my father at times. I just couldn't believe that I was watching a film. It was like they'd got my pa and he was up there on the screen. So it was very disturbing in many ways, apart from the content of the film, which I found very moving. To see my father just the way I knew him was extraordinary.
Now I understand the family actually had asked that Hopkins play the part.
Yeah, my sister was very clear that he was the right person, and she wrote a personal letter which went to the production company Seesaw, who sent it presumably to his agent, and I gather that was part of the reason why he felt it was something he would look at.
Eva, you're sitting there watching this movie for the first time. You're seeing children. They're actors. But you see yourself. Can you just describe what it was like to watch this film the very first time?
Yes, I was very aware that I was not an audience person watching a movie about somebody else, that this was my lived experience. And it awakened a lot of past history for me in a way that surprised me, because I'm old and I've done lots of things that have seemingly put this behind me, but it blew all of that past right into the present. Not in a negative way at all, but in a way that has made me very interested in this film in the educational capacity it has.
You are an educator in your current...
I am an educator, and I have very tunnel vision in this department. And so I think the film is extremely important. I think it shows what one person can do. That's what one of the things it obviously is. It's a focus of the film, but I think has great potential today to be added to the canon of educational materials for Holocaust education. And I see the film with lots of potential for bringing, I don't like to call it a story, bringing an event that happened those years ago to the present in the political context that we're in now. And I'm hoping that lots of people will take on the mission of using the film that way.
Refugee children.
Exactly.
Being stuck.
Yes.
And not being able to get out.
And we, the people now today, and particularly not my generation, but the younger people, have an obligation, I believe, to act on what they see and not just sit back, and to emulate what Nicky's mission was and what he did. And I'm hoping that that will happen. I'm an optimist.
James, you're a British director. You're showing that the British government was not all that excited about taking in refugees, particularly Jewish refugees. And how is that being received by today's British population?
Honestly. And I'm just going to, as a Brit, point out that Nicky Winton made quite a point of the fact that he'd written to the President of the United States and got similarly rebuffed by Washington. I think there are two things to say. First, I'm going to tell you a brief story. Early in the production, we went on a scouting trip to the station, Central Station, where a statue of Nicholas stands at the end of platform
Central
1.
Station in Prague.
In Prague. And there he is with one child over his shoulder and another in his hand, and often there are fresh flowers laid there. It tells you how actively remembered and acknowledged he is in the Czech Republic. And we, just a crew of 6 at that point, were taking our photos for Insta or Facebook or whatever. And suddenly there's a disturbance in the background. And there's police, and there is radio chatter, people in high-vis jackets, and a large group of people, children crying. And it gives me tingles, goosebumps now to think about it, because we suddenly realized that these were refugees from Ukraine, women and children arriving, and this was in the first weeks of the war, right there over Nicky's shoulder. Mm-hmm. At that time, the British government was among many making it very difficult to receive refugees into the country. Same thing was happening in 1939, where there were protests at then Croydon London Airport against allowing refugees into the country. So I think it rings with people as honest. Obviously, there are many people who don't think we should be receiving refugees. One of my big pleas for the film, and I don't want it to be seen only as an educational tool with huge agreement with Eva and acceptance of its importance, but is that we redefine as individuals, you and I, what we mean by the word refugee. If we're honest, we all tend to think of somebody in need, very few belongings, probably a large needy family that's going to be a burden on our state and our taxes. Here's a refugee who's become a prominent educator. Here's a grandson of refugees. Nicky Winton was himself the son of refugees, who we now in Britain own as a proud Englishman, who was, of course, only just one generation into being that. We need to rethink what we think of those people, whether they're from Czechoslovakia or from Syria. Many of them have become powerful contributors to our countries now, and it's getting me angry and political just to think about it. But if that film makes us ask some of those questions or ask them of some of our politicians, then it's more than done its job.
Nick, your father was not just involved in the rescue and visiting and getting those lists together in Czechoslovakia. He was also masterminding a marketing campaign to try and get the British public to put pressure on the government. He was a photographer. He took pictures in Czechoslovakia. He had them published in newspapers. Tell us a little bit about that. He was a stockbroker. He wasn't a marketing man.
Well, he was also a humanitarian, and I think for me the message is less about refugees, although the story in essence is about refugees. It's about one man who sees injustice and wants to make a difference, and he used whatever tools he had available, whatever gifts he had, to do his part. And part of it was instigating that there should be a program, and the people in Prague were at far more risk than he ever was. He then came back from his holiday to London to see what he could do to mobilise resources in the UK, in Great Britain. So he wrote articles for newspapers, letters encouraging donations to try and make it possible. Each child needed a guarantor of £50 to repatriate them afterwards. Well, £50 in today's currency is close to $4,000. It's a lot of money for each child. He had to find foster homes for them, people who would look after them.
Can you only imagine?
And he worked tirelessly after his job in the daytime finished. He worked in the evenings and weekends for 9 months to try and see what he could accomplish. And given that it was only 9 months, it's remarkable that he managed to find homes for so many children.
Eva, you grew up in England. You were in a foster home.
Yes.
What was that like for you?
Well, we were very, very, very fortunate. I think that the photographs that are shown in the film, where people choose to take a refugee, went round to. There were advertisements in newspapers and in the Picture Post, and I think religious communities said, we will take some, you know, the Mothers Union said, come on folks, we will take some refugees, and Milliners and my picture ended up in a little town called Ashton-under-Lyne in Lancashire near Manchester, and this couple, Roland and Flora Ratcliffe, said they would take one child. And then they saw this picture of myself and my sister, and I'm redundant here, but I have to say it, I was very, very cute at those times. and I had my arms around...
You're still cute.
I had my arms around my sister's neck, and they decided that they could not separate us. That did not happen to all the children, as we saw as we see in the film. So we lived in a row house, as it's called here, a terrace house, 2 up, 2 down. That describes it precisely. And they had a 16-year-old daughter, Mary. And at 16 in those days, that was school leaving age, and she was already working in the mill. And amazing. Mary went to live with Grandma 2 or 3 streets away so that they could take the 2 of us. And they were absolutely wonderful. And, you know, to think now, in the current situation, of bringing 2 young children, I was 3.5, my sister was 9, with what I call as no sell-by date. You brought them into your home and you had no clue how long or what was going to happen. It was just simply remarkable. And that's another piece of the courage of my mother to put us on the train, and the courage of people like the Ratcliffes to take us into their home. And we, again, were very fortunate. We maintained a relationship with them throughout our lives. We became part of that community. Macmillan and I were very rare happening. Our parents both escaped different ways, other stories.
Wow. And
we were reunited in 1940. My mother escaped after the war via Norway, after war had started. So that was another experience. But we remained close to the Ratcliffes. They took my parents in, not literally, figuratively, helped them learn English. You know, we became part of their lives until they died. They came to my wedding. They met my first child. They were a remarkable couple, and there are many people who did that at that time. When, in fact, they found homes for 669 of us.
What an inspiration.
Absolutely.
James, you decided to tackle this almost in 2 parts. The younger Nick Winton, the older Nick Winton. And it seems that, and again, where the film is just so powerful, I don't want to spoil anything in the story development. But there's a moment when all of his memorabilia, all of his historical material is about to be tossed. And nobody's interested. You know, it reminds me of the Diary of Anne Frank when it was found, and initially nobody wanted to publish it. And then there was just one person, and it's fascinating that you decided to include her name, Elizabeth Maxwell from the Maxwell family, whose husband, of course, was the controversial Robert Maxwell. And
she was less controversial. we chose to include her because of the connection to the story and, of course, the connection to Czechoslovakia, his connection. She was a really significant Holocaust historian. And at the time that this was happening, was preparing for, and Nick may be able to help me here, organising a particular conference that is talked about by historians since to have been a real step change in the study and education of Holocaust history. So that random connection through somebody who knew somebody who suggested that maybe the scrapbook might be of interest to her was vital in this story surviving and finding the public understanding that it since has. It would have been wrong to exclude that part of the story and that woman from this history.
And from my perspective, it made the story more real, if you will, because we knew who she was in a sense, and it made sure it wasn't a fictionalized version of what happened. It was a very important piece, I thought, of that. Yes.
What was even more extraordinary is in the scrapbook was a list of the children who had been on the trains and the foster families that had taken them in. And she did something very simple but quite extraordinary, which is to write to all of the foster families 50 years later to say, I don't know if you still are living there or are in touch with them, but do you know what happened to her? And 669, after 50 years, you wouldn't think many of them would still be living in the same house even. And she got a few replies, and that was the beginning of the reconnection of those children.
And an opportunity to really recognize Nicholas Winton.
Well, that wasn't particularly important to my father.
Right.
It was the beginning of the story coming to light.
But you asked me how it affected me, so I'm on those lists, and to see the lists in the film is astonishing, and just it was a really amazing experience. Yeah.
I think something that the survivors and their children have talked about is the way, it's a phrase that's really stuck with me, that Nicky was a lightning rod to their history. In many ways, as many after the war had found themselves completely disconnected, bereft, divorced from who they were, their identity, and in many cases where they'd come from. And it was enough that these families were giving up as much as we just heard of the Ratcliffes to take somebody in. It was a lot then in the 1930s and 40s to expect them to be able to connect to their past and give them history. Suddenly, decades later, here was a man and a moment that allowed these individuals to begin to discover who they were and who they belonged to.
We don't want to talk about that part.
Okay, we're not talking about that part.
No.
The moment.
Remember you said that?
Yes, I know. Well, I haven't talked about the moment. The moment's on the film.
The film is called One Life. In Sanhedrin, in the Talmud, it says, save one life, save the world. That's what this film is about. It's about a remarkable man, a remarkable cast and crew, and a remarkable group of people involved in its production. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today. See the film and
cry.
Have your handkerchiefs nearby.
Yeah.
Because when I saw it, I bawled. And we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you.